In the harshest corners of the frontier, a woman's honor was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a single misstep or a whispered rumor. But what happens when the very act that could destroy her is the only thing that can save her life? Stay with us as we unravel this tale, and be sure to share your thoughts on it in the comments below. The world, for Silas, was measured in the swing of an axe and the breadth of the horizon. His cabin stood as a solitary monument to stubbornness against a sky that was too big and land that was too empty. It was built of lodgepole pine he'd felled and hewn himself, each notch a testament to a day's hard labor, each plank a scar earned from the wilderness. The lines at the corners of his eyes came from years of wind and dust, not laughter. He moved with a quiet economy, born of solitude, never a wasted step or a superfluous gesture. Mornings were for checking snares, afternoons for chopping wood, and evenings for sitting on his porch, a rifle across his lap, watching the sun bleed out across the western ridges. He had come to this place to forget the noise of the world, but the silence he found was louder, filled with the ghosts of a life he no longer lived. His hands, calloused and thick, remembered the feel of a smaller hand held within them, a memory that came unbidden in the cold hours before dawn. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts: to survive, to endure, and to watch. This watchfulness was a habit he couldn't break, a duty to a family that was now just dust and memory. He scanned the plains not for game, but for threats, his gaze lingering on any curl of dust or unfamiliar shadow. It was a penance, this lonely vigil, a promise made to those he couldn't protect, that he would remain a bulwark against the chaos that had claimed him. The land was unforgiving, and it had taught him its language, the shiver of aspens before a storm, the cry of a hawk that signaled a predator below, the unnatural stillness that preceded violence. He was a part of it now, as weathered and silent as the granite outcrops that broke the monotony of the prairie. His thoughts were his own, unspoken and unshared, a river running deep beneath a frozen surface. He felt no need for words when the crack of a dry twig underfoot said all that needed to be said about caution, or the warmth of the fire said all that needed to be said about comfort. He had built his life into a fortress of routine, a wall against the past, and he had no intention of ever letting the world back in. It was the hawk's cry that broke the afternoon stillness, not a cry of hunting, but of alarm. Silas stilled, his hand resting on the handle of the axe buried in a half-split log. His eyes, trained by instinct and loss, scanned the low ridge to the south. He saw then a flicker of movement that didn't belong. Not deer, not coyote. It was the desperate, stumbling gait of a person. Then another. He set the axe down without a sound and moved to the cabin, retrieving the long rifle from its pegs over the door. Through the spyglass he kept on the mantel, the scene resolved into grim clarity. Two women, one leaning heavily on the other, their clothes torn and smeared with dirt. The taller one, with dark hair plastered to her brow, moved with a fierce, protective determination, her arm a vice around the smaller one's waist. The other, younger, favored a leg so badly she could barely walk, her face pale with pain and exhaustion. They were heading toward the creek on his land, the only source of fresh water for miles. Silas watched them, his jaw tight. This was a complication his solitude could not afford. Trouble followed people, and these two were steeped in it. He could see the tremor in their limbs, even from this distance, the way the taller one's head constantly swiveled, searching the back trail. They were being hunted. He remained where he was, a stone figure behind the dusty glass of his window, his mind a cold calculus of risk. To help them was to invite their hunters to his door. To ignore them was to leave them for the wolves, both four-legged and two. He watched them reach the creek and collapse, the younger one's strength finally giving out. The older sister, he assumed they were sisters, immediately began tearing a strip from her petticoat to soak in the water, her movements frantic but purposeful. He saw the deep, ingrained honor of his father, the quiet strength of his mother, and the echo of a promise to protect the vulnerable. The calculation was over. He slung a canteen over his shoulder, checked the load in his rifle, and stepped out into the harsh afternoon sun, his long shadow stretching out before him like a judgment. The snap of a twig under his boot was all it took. The older sister was on her feet in an instant, a rock in her hand, her body shielding the prone form of the younger. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a defiant, cornered animal ferocity. She was ready to fight a bear with a pebble. Silas stopped a good 20 paces away, holding the rifle loosely in one hand, the barrel pointed at the ground. He made no sudden moves. He simply stood there, letting her see him, letting the silence stretch. He noted the dark, dried blood staining the younger girl's dress near her calf, the exhaustion that pulled at the older one's features, making her look both ancient and young. "You're on my land," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. It wasn't a threat, just a statement of fact. The woman didn't reply. Her gaze flickered from his face to the rifle, then back again. He could see her weighing her options, finding none. He unslung the canteen and set it on the ground between them. He nudged it forward with the toe of his boot. Water. Her eyes narrowed in suspicion, but the sight of the younger sister, whose lips were cracked and pale, made her decision. With painstaking slowness, never taking her eyes off him, she crouched, snatched the canteen, and scuttled back to her sister's side. She helped the girl drink, her movements gentle but efficient. Silas waited. The sun beat down on his neck. When the girl had drunk her fill, the older one rose again, her expression unchanged. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low and tense. "That leg needs seeing to," he said, nodding toward the injured girl. "And a storm's coming." He gestured with his chin to the bruised purple clouds gathering in the west. "My cabin's 1/2 a mile." He wasn't asking. He was stating the options as the land had laid them out. Stay here and face the storm and whatever was behind them, or trust him. The distrust radiated from her, a palpable heat. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of people who had learned that the only person you could rely on was yourself. He turned his back on them, a calculated risk. "Follow the creek north. You'll see it." He began walking, his pace steady, not looking back. He was offering a choice, not forcing one. He was halfway to the cabin when he heard the faint sounds behind him, the rustle of cloth, a soft cry of pain, and the slow, determined shuffle of feet. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a stone hearth and the smell of wood smoke, pine, and cured leather. It was meticulously clean, a space of severe order. A bed built into one wall, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, and shelves holding tins and sacks of flour. When Elara she had given her name and her sister's, Lyra, in a clipped, reluctant tone half-carried her sibling over the threshold. She paused, her eyes taking in the Spartan interior. It was the home of a man who owned nothing he didn't need. Silas gestured to the hearth, where a clean blanket was already laid out. Set her there. While Elara eased her sister down, Silas moved to the fireplace, adding wood from the box and hanging a kettle of water to warm. He did not hover or offer platitudes. He worked. The silence in the small room was thick and heavy, broken only by Lyra's shallow breathing and the crackle of the fire. Elara stood sentinel beside her sister, her arms crossed, watching every move Silas made. Her posture was a wall of suspicion. When the water was warm, Silas brought over a clean cloth, a bowl, and a small tin of salve. He knelt, not near Lyra, but a respectful distance away. "The wound needs cleaning," he said, his gaze on Elara, not the injured girl. "It's festering." Elara's jaw hardened. "I'll do it." Silas simply nodded and placed the bowl and cloth on the floor. "The water's hot. Add some from the bucket to cool it. The salve is willow bark and yarrow. It will fight the infection." He stood up and retreated to the other side of the room, turning his back to give them a semblance of privacy as he busied himself checking the action on his rifle. He could hear the soft hiss of cloth against skin, a sharp intake of breath from Lyra, and Elara's soothing, whispered words in a language he didn't recognize. He cleaned the rifle with deliberate, methodical movements, the familiar clicks of the mechanism a counterpoint to the tense drama unfolding behind him. After a long while, Elara spoke, her voice strained. "The cut! It's deep. There are splinters in it." Silas finished his task and turned. He looked at the wound. It was worse than he'd thought. A jagged gash, swollen and red, with dark slivers of wood embedded deep in the flesh. Elara had cleaned the surface, but she lacked the tools or the nerve to go deeper. Lyra was shivering now, her forehead slick with sweat. Silas met Elara's gaze. In her eyes, he saw a battle between pride and fear. Fear won. He gave a single, slow nod. "Hold her steady." He washed his hands thoroughly, scrubbing them with harsh soap until they were raw. He laid out a thin, sharp knife and a pair of tweezers, holding their tips in the fire until they glowed. He knelt beside Lyra, ignoring Elara's nearness, the way her entire body was coiled like a spring. "This will hurt," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the feverish girl. He looked at Elara. "Hold her hand. Don't let her thrash." The next few minutes were a blur of focused, grim work. He touched Lyra's bare skin, his calloused fingers surprisingly steady as he probed the wound, his movements precise and economical. Lyra cried out, a raw, sharp sound, and Elara held her tighter, her knuckles white. Silas worked on, his face an unreadable mask, extracting one splinter, then another, his world narrowed to the small, damaged piece of flesh before him. He was aware of Elara's breath, her scent of dust and fear, and the intense, burning scrutiny of her stare. It was a violation, this intimacy, a trespass born of brutal necessity. When the last sliver of wood was out, he cleaned the wound again, applied the salve, and bound it tightly with clean linen. Only then did he sit back on his heels, the tension draining from his shoulders. He had touched her. In this world, that was a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. The silence that fell was different now, heavier, charged with a new and unspoken complication. The storm broke as night fell, a violent onslaught of wind and rain that lashed against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire pushed back the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows. Lyra slept, her breathing still shallow but more regular, the fever-induced flush on her cheeks starting to recede. Silas sat at the table, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone filling the small space. Elara sat on the floor beside her sister, her back against the wall, her gaze fixed on the flames. She hadn't spoken a word since he had finished dressing the wound. The unspoken had settled between them, a tangible presence. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes dark and serious in the flickering light. "You are a stranger to us. You have seen my sister's skin. You have touched her." Her voice was flat, devoid of accusation, a simple statement of an undeniable fact. Silas stopped his work, resting his hands on the table. He met her gaze and waited. "Where we come from," she continued, "the law is clear. A man's touch on an unmarried woman, outside of her family, it stains her. It makes her unfit." Silas said nothing. He knew the harsh, unwritten codes of the frontier, the way reputation was a woman's only currency, and how easily it could be spent by others. "Gossip is a wind that carries fire," she said, her voice dropping lower. "It will find us, and it will burn us." He could see the grim logic spooling out in her mind. They were two women, alone and vulnerable. Even if they survived their pursuers, they would be outcasts. Any town they went to, any community they tried to join, the story would follow them or be invented. Two women living in a lone man's cabin. The conclusion was foregone. "We have nothing," Elara stated, her pride a brittle thing. "No money, no family to speak for us. A good name is all we have left to bargain with." She finally got to the point, her words as sharp and direct as the knife in his hands. "You must marry me." Silas stared at her. The demand was audacious, desperate, and in its own way, brutally practical. It was not a proposal of the heart, but a transaction of survival. A shield. His name, the protection of a husband, would make her and her sister untouchable. It would transform their scandalous predicament into a respectable arrangement. "It is the only way," she insisted, her chin high, "to protect her, to protect me." Her gaze was unwavering, challenging him. He saw no weakness in it, only a fierce, pragmatic will to live, to shield her own. He looked away from her, toward the shuttered window where the rain beat a relentless rhythm. His life had been a fortress built to keep the world out. She was asking him to not only open the gate, but to invite the world in, with all its complications and dangers. As if on cue, his dog, who had been sleeping by the door, lifted its head, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Silas rose in one fluid motion, grabbing his rifle. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The growl was not for the storm. It was for the scent of men and horses, carried on the wind. The growl subsided as the scent faded, a passing patrol or riders seeking a different shelter. But the message was clear. They were not safe. The threat that had driven the sisters to his doorstep was still out there, circling. Silas bolted the door and added a heavy bar, his movements economical and grim. He turned back to Elara, who had risen to her feet, her hand gripping the iron poker from the hearth. The moment of vulnerability had passed, replaced once again by the hardened survivor. He did not address her proposal directly. An answer was a promise, and he did not make promises lightly. Instead, his response was action. He gestured to the rifle he'd been cleaning earlier, which now leaned against the wall near the table. "Do you know how to use one?" Elara's eyes flickered to the weapon. "I have fired a pistol." "Once. Not the same," he said. He picked up the rifle and held it out to her, but first. She hesitated for a moment before taking it. The weapon was heavy in her hands, its cold, oiled steel a stark reality. "It kicks, hard. Brace it against your shoulder, snug." He walked her through the motions, his voice a low, patient murmur. How to check the load, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the long barrel. He didn't touch her, but stood close, his instructions precise. "Don't pull the trigger. Squeeze it. Slow and steady, like you're wringing out a cloth." She was a quick study. She listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration, mimicking his movements. There was no wasted motion in her, a mirror of his own efficiency. They were two of a kind, shaped by hardship into pragmatic, unsentimental beings. Over the next few days, this became their routine. A silent partnership forged in the shadow of a shared threat. In the mornings, he would hunt or chop wood, and she would tend to Lyra, whose strength was slowly returning. In the afternoons, they practiced. He set up tins on a fence post 50 yards from the cabin, and she would shoot, the rifle's report echoing across the empty land. At first, her shots were wide, the recoil jarring her, but she did not complain. She simply reloaded and tried again, her jaw set in determination. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs the land offered. He showed her the game trails, the edible plants, the places an ambush might be laid. He spoke more in those few days than he had in the previous year, but the talk was all functional, a transfer of knowledge necessary for survival. In the evenings, they shared a meal. They would sit at the small table, Lyra propped up by the fire, the three of them eating his stew or pan-fried rabbit in near silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was filled with the shared understanding of the day's work, of the rifle practice, of the constant, vigilant watch they both kept on the horizon. Trust was not spoken. It was built, plank by plank, like the walls of his cabin. It was in the way she no longer watched his every move with suspicion, and in the way he began leaving the cabin for longer periods, confident that she could defend it and her sister in his absence. The marriage proposal was never mentioned again. It hung in the air, a fact that had been stated and was now being proven, not with words, but with the slow, steady weaving of their lives into a single, unified defense against the coming dark. The predators announced their arrival with arrogance. 3 riders appeared on the ridge at midday, sitting their horses against the skyline, clear and unafraid. They were not trying to be subtle. It was a display of power, an act of intimidation. Silas was splitting logs when he saw them. He didn't stop his motion, completing the swing of the axe with a clean, powerful crack. He set the axe down, wiped his hands on his trousers, and moved toward the cabin, his pace unhurried. Inside, Elara was already at the window, the rifle in her hands. She had seen them too. Lara was sitting up, her face pale, her eyes wide with a fear that was old and familiar. "Get her away from the window," Silas said, his voice calm. "Against the hearth. It's the thickest wall." Elara guided her sister to the relative safety of the stone fireplace without a word. Her movements were steady, her hands sure. The fear was in her eyes, but it was a cold, hard fear now, not the panicked terror of before. It was the fear of a soldier, not a victim. Silas took his own rifle and a box of cartridges, settling near the other window, which gave him a clear angle on the approaching men. He and Elara now flanked the single door, a unified front. The riders ambled their horses down the slope, their laughter carrying on the wind. The man in the lead was big, with a dirty beard and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed a cruel, sneering face. This was Jedediah. He reined in his horse 20 yards from the porch, his men fanning out on either side of him. "Ho, the cabin!" He called out, his voice thick with false bonhomie. "We're looking for a couple of strays. 2 sisters, young thing and her minder." "Seen 'em?" Silas remained silent, watching them from the shadows of the room. He observed their weapons, their posture, the nervous shifting of their horses. They were scavengers, accustomed to preying on the weak. Jedediah's grin faltered at the lack of response. "No need to be shy. We know they came this way. They're property of the Black Creek mining concern. Ran off. There's a reward for their return." The lie was as shabby as the man who told it. Silas knew there was no mining concern for 100 miles. "This is private land," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly through the window. "You're not welcome. Ride on." Jedediah's eyes narrowed, scanning the cabin. He saw only the dark rectangle of the window. "Now, hold on. We don't want no trouble. Just send out the girls, and we'll be on our way. The dark-haired one is promised to me. We have an arrangement." He patted the saddlebag at his side, as if it contained a legal document and not a bottle of whiskey. Behind him, Silas heard Elara's sharp intake of breath. He didn't need to look to know the fury and disgust on her face. "There are no girls here," Silas said, his voice flat and final. "There's just me, and I'm telling you to leave, now." The pretense of civility dropped. Jedediah's face hardened into a mask of pure menace. "That's a nice, lonely spot you got here. Be a shame if something were to happen to it. Or you." He spat on the ground. "We'll be back, and when we come back, we're coming in." He wheeled his horse around, his men following suit. They kicked their mounts into a gallop, riding away not with the urgency of a retreat, but with the swagger of a promise. They would be back, and it would be soon. The immediate threat was gone, but the certainty of its return settled over the cabin like a shroud. Silas watched them until they were specks on the horizon. He turned from the window. Elara was still standing by the hearth, her knuckles white where she gripped the rifle. Her face was a storm of emotions. He walked over to the water bucket, dipped the ladle, and drank deeply. He then held the ladle out to her. She took it, her hand trembling slightly as she drank. Their eyes met over the rim. In that single shared glance, everything was confirmed. They were in this together. The home he had built for solitude was now a fortress for three. The fight was no longer his or theirs. It was ours. The quiet that followed the rider's departure was heavier than any before it. It was the calm at the center of a storm, a borrowed peace. Lyra had fallen into a troubled sleep by the fire, her small face creased with worry, even in her dreams. Silas and Elara moved about the cabin with a silent, shared purpose. There was no discussion of what was to come. It was as plain as the rifle in her hands and the grim set of his jaw. He methodically boarded up the smaller of the two windows, leaving only a narrow slit to see and shoot through. Elara, seeing his intent, found a hammer and brought him the nails without being asked. They worked in tandem, the rhythmic tapping of the hammer the only sound. He was strong, his movements powerful and efficient. She was quick, anticipating his needs, her hands deftly sorting nails, holding boards in place. It was a dance of grim preparation. Later, as dusk began to settle, he took her outside. He pointed to the natural features of his land, a rocky outcrop, a thicket of birch, a shallow ditch near the creek. From the west window, you can cover the approach from the ridge, he said, his voice low. If they come from the creek, they'll use this ditch for cover. That's my spot. He was not just giving orders. He was sharing his tactical knowledge, treating her as an equal, a fellow soldier. They'll likely wait for dark or first light. They think we're scared, they'll be overconfident. He handed her a small pistol, smaller and lighter than the rifle. Keep this with you. For close work, if they breach the door. She took the weapon, its weight a dense, cold promise in her palm. She checked its load, her movements now practiced and familiar. He watched her, a flicker of something respect, perhaps in his eyes. The stoic protector saw the capable survivor. He saw a strength that matched his own, forged in a different but equally merciless fire. They went back inside as the last light faded. Silas did not light the main lamp, leaving the cabin in the deep shadows of the firelight. He took up his position by the west window, and she took hers by the boarded one, their fields of fire crossing to cover the door. They waited. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the soft breathing of the sleeping girl. In the long, silent vigil, a strange sense of peace settled over Silas. For the first time in years, he was not alone in his watch. The solitude he had so carefully cultivated had been a shield, but also a prison. Now there was another presence in the dark with him, another pair of eyes scanning the night, another steady hand on a weapon. He looked across the shadowed room at Elara's silhouette. She was perfectly still, a statue of vigilance. He thought of her proposal, spoken in desperation, but now sealed in shared purpose. Marriage, a home, a family, things he had locked away with his grief. He had thought his life was over, that this existence was all that was left, an epilogue of survival. But the woman across the room, with her fierce pride and quiet courage, was not an epilogue. She was a new chapter, beginning in violence and shadow, but a beginning nonetheless. A low whimper came from the hearth. Lyra was stirring, caught in a nightmare. Before Silas could move, Elara was there, kneeling beside her sister, stroking her hair, murmuring soft words that quelled the fear. She was both warrior and nurturer, a combination of steel and solace that left him breathless. He turned back to the window, his grip tightening on his rifle. The predators could come. Let them come. He was no longer just defending a piece of land. He was defending a future. They came just before dawn, in the gray, liminal light when the world is half asleep. The dog gave a single, low woof before Silas silenced it with a hand on its neck. He saw them through the slit in the window 4 figures, not 3, moving on foot, low and fast, using the pre-dawn shadows for cover. They had left their horses tethered out of sight. They were smarter than he'd given them credit for. He didn't need to say a word. Elara was already in position, the long barrel of the rifle resting on the sill of her window, her breathing slow and even. Lyra was awake, huddled by the hearth with a thick blanket pulled around her, her eyes wide but silent. She had learned the discipline of survival. 2 men, including Jedediah, moved toward the front door, while the other 2 split, circling to the sides. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to divide and overwhelm. Silas had anticipated it. His gaze was fixed on the man circling toward his side of the cabin, who was using the woodpile for cover. Elara's focus was on the other, who was slinking toward the blind spot under her window. The world seemed to slow down, the seconds stretching into eternities. The only sound was the thumping of his own heart. The signal was a sharp whistle from Jedediah. The instant it sounded, the man by the woodpile rose, a pistol in his hand, ready to lay down covering fire. It was the last mistake he ever made. Silas's rifle cracked, a single deafening explosion in the morning quiet. The man was thrown backward, a puppet with its strings cut. Simultaneously, a shot rang out from Elara's window. She had waited for her target to break cover, and her aim was true. The second man screamed and clutched his leg, falling into the open. The coordinated, immediate response stunned Jedediah and his remaining man. They had expected fear, panic, perhaps a wild, inaccurate shot. They had not expected a disciplined, deadly defense. They dove for cover behind the low stone wall of the long-dead garden. "Witch!" Jedediah roared, his voice laced with shock and rage. He fired blindly at the cabin, the bullet splintering the wood of the door. "You'll pay for that." Now the real fight began. It was not a battle of volleys, but of single, calculated shots. A game of patience and angles. Gunsmoke filled the small cabin, acrid and sharp. Silas reloaded, his movements swift and sure. He peered through the smoke, catching a glimpse of a hat as the 4th man tried to get a better angle. He fired again, and the hat flew off, followed by a curse. They were pinned down. Elara was a rock. She did not waste ammunition. She waited, watched, and only fired when she had a clear target. She was protecting her flank, forcing the injured man to stay down, preventing him from becoming a threat again. Silas focused on Jedediah and the other man, keeping them trapped behind the wall. The sun began to rise, its light catching the thin tendrils of smoke, turning the grim scene into something surreal. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the loading and firing, the splintering of wood, the angry whine of ricochets, and the steady, reassuring presence of the woman who fought beside him. They were a unit, moving and thinking as one. Their silent partnership now a deadly alliance. The stalemate was broken by desperation. Jedediah, realizing a direct assault was suicide, resorted to a baser tactic. "Fire!" he screamed at his remaining man. "Burn them out!" The man fumbled in his saddlebag, which he'd carried with him, and pulled out a bottle and a rag, a firebomb. It was a crude but effective weapon against a dry timber cabin. Silas saw the flicker of the match, the rag catching flame. There was no time for a clean shot. "Down!" he yelled to Elara. The bottle arced through the air, smashing against the wall near her window. Burning liquid splashed across the logs. Flames erupted, licking hungrily at the dry wood. Smoke began to pour into the cabin. The situation had changed in a heartbeat. They were no longer in a fortress. They were in a trap. Panic seized the air. Lyra coughed, her eyes streaming. The smoke was thick and blinding, but Elara did not panic. Through the haze, Silas saw her move, grabbing a heavy wool blanket from his bed. She beat at the flames, her movements swift and desperate, but not frantic. While she fought the fire, Silas knew he had to end the fight outside. The attackers, emboldened by the fire, were preparing for their final rush. He took a deep breath, held it, and peered through the smoke-filled window slit. Jedediah was rising from behind the wall, his pistol aimed, a triumphant sneer on his face. He thought he had won. Silas squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. Jedediah's sneer vanished, replaced by a look of profound surprise. He staggered back, clutching his chest, and fell. The last man, seeing his leader fall, broke. He scrambled to his feet and ran, a wild, panicked flight back toward the horses. Silas worked the lever action, the empty cartridge ejecting with a sharp metallic sound. He took aim at the fleeing figure, his finger tightening on the trigger. He paused. The man was running, not fighting. He was no longer a threat. He lowered the rifle. Behind him, Elara had smothered the last of the flames. The wall was charred and blackened, and the cabin was choked with smoke, but they were safe. The injured man on the ground was moaning, holding his shattered leg. The fight was over. Silence descended once more, broken only by the crackle of smoldering wood and Lyra's ragged coughing. Silas turned from the window. He and Elara looked at each other across the smoky, debris-strewn room. They were covered in soot, their faces grimed, their ears ringing. But they were alive. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them, and they had stood together. They had won. In the aftermath, the world seemed unnervingly quiet. The sun was fully up now, casting a clean, impartial light on the grim tableau outside. The bodies lay where they had fallen. The injured man had dragged himself a few yards before passing out from pain and blood loss. Silas went out first, his rifle held ready, though he knew the danger was past. He methodically checked the bodies, his face a mask of stone. It was ugly work, but necessary. There was nothing to be done for Jedediah or the first man. He used the man's own belt to fashion a tourniquet for the one with the shattered leg. He would live to face whatever justice the nearest town might dispense. Elara emerged from the cabin, helping a pale but steady Lyra into the fresh air. The smoke still billowed from the doorway. Elara's eyes swept over the scene, her expression somber. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a deep, weary sorrow for the violence that had been necessary. She looked at Silas as he finished tying the tourniquet. He was no longer just a protector. He was a man who had killed to defend them. He had taken lives to save theirs. This was a debt that could never be spoken of, but would always exist between them. He stood up, wiping his hands on his trousers. He met her gaze. "It's over," he said, and the two words carried the weight of the entire morning. They worked for the next hour in near silence, a team cleaning up the wreckage of the battle. He dragged the bodies away from the cabin, covering them with a tarp. She aired out the cabin, sweeping up the shattered glass and debris. Lyra, wanting to help, brought them water from the creek. The simple domestic acts were a stark contrast to the violence that had preceded them. They were reclaiming their space, scrubbing away the stain of the attack. When the worst of it was done, Silas went to the two remaining horses, which were still tethered and spooked. He calmed them with a low voice and a steady hand, leading them to his small corral. Elara watched him. She saw the gentleness in his hands, the same hands that had been so steady and deadly with a rifle just an hour before. She saw the profound decency of the man beneath the stoic, silent exterior. He was a man who would kill to protect, but who took no pleasure in it. A man who would tend to an enemy's wound after the fight was done. Later, they sat on the porch steps, the three of them. The sun was warm on their faces. The air was clean again. They drank water from tin cups, the silence comfortable now, earned. They had faced death together and survived. The shared trauma had burned away the last vestiges of distrust, leaving behind a bond that was stronger than steel. Silas looked out at the horizon. His horizon which no longer seemed so empty. It was the same land, the same sky, but he was seeing it through different eyes. His solitude was broken, his fortress breached, and he found he was not sorry. He felt the weight of two lives entwined with his, and it did not feel like a burden. It felt like an anchor. The next morning, Silas was up before the sun, his axe ringing in the cool, clear air. He was splitting wood to replace the fire-damaged logs of the cabin wall. The familiar, rhythmic work helped to settle his mind. He was a builder, a mender. It was what he knew how to do. Elara came out of the cabin, carrying a cup of coffee for him. She had found his stash of beans and figured out how to work the grinder and percolator. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was the act of a partner, not a guest. She handed him the cup, their fingers brushing. The brief contact sent a jolt through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "I have a question," she said, her voice quiet in the morning stillness. He stopped his work and looked at her, truly looked at her. The harshness and fear had softened from her face, replaced by a calm strength. "You never answered me." He knew what she meant. The proposal. The marriage of convenience that had become something more. He set the cup and axe down. He turned to face her fully. "What we did. Yesterday," he began, his words slow, chosen with care. "We fought for this place. Together. A home is more than wood and stone. It's the people who defend it." He looked at the cabin, his gaze taking in the blackened scar on its wall. It was no longer a monument to his past, to his loss. It was a testament to their survival, to their future. "My answer is yes," he said, his voice clear and steady. "If you will have me. Not for protection, or for reputation, but because this is your home now. Yours and Lyra's, if you choose it." A slow smile spread across Elara's face, the first genuine smile he had ever seen from her. It transformed her, chasing the last of the shadows from her eyes. It was like watching the sun rise. "We choose it," she said softly. From the doorway, Lyra watched them, a matching smile on her own face. The fear was gone, replaced by the simple, profound joy of a child who has finally found a safe harbor. The harshness of the land remained, the dangers of the frontier had not vanished, but they would face it together. The solitary protector, the resilient survivors, they were no longer just archetypes of survival. They were a family forged in silence, tested by fire, and bound by a quiet, unspoken love. Silas picked up his axe again, but this time the rhythm of his work felt different. It was not the lonely labor of a man holding back the wilderness. It was the hopeful, steady beat of a man building a life. He swung the axe, and the sound that echoed across the plains was not one of solitude, but of a new beginning.